I'm going to jump straight into setup. I think this debate is regarding heavy investments, which probably looks at the manifestation of this life extension technology where you have money, where you have R&D, you have focus on extending the life, which means you probably put a lot of manpower within these particular things. But it's also important to note what's within the info slide, right? As to how this particular technology doesn't necessarily cure, but what it does is that it extends your life to probably a maximum of 125 years. But what's also important here, and we draw the parallel to, for example, Elon Musk and SpaceX. Because the people who probably opt into investing into these particular technologies probably be the super ultra rich like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, right? We think then what it means here is that simply because, for example, they are able to control the narratives as individuals who have high influences within multiple contexts, it means that they're always able to propagate a lot of narrative for these particular technology. What we actually recognize and give you in counterfactual and government side is that we'd rather put this particular investment into imminent diseases that actually needs cure. So for example, things like HIV or cancer, or even things that are a lot more common for multiple people within multiple societies, like high blood pressure, these particular diabetes, like, treatments, all of these particular things means that at a point which you have more money, for example, sit down, you are able to find for such particular cure. But we also think then when you have a large and significant amount of these particular investments probably not put into this particular technology, you probably have betterments within hospitals because simply you just have more money, you just have a surplus of this where you're able then to put this particular thing. The strategic conclusion here is that you need a lot of money for opposition then to actually make this particular technology one that is valuable. So it means that the resource that they have is something symmetrical that we have as well, but rather we're able to fuel these particular things within the particular things that I told you. No, thank you. The framing here first is on metric, right? We think that you ought to judge this particular debate within two particular things. The first is what value does it give to the healthcare industry, right? Because at the point in which you're able to utilize a particular resource, given the significant investments that they necessarily have to give, we think there are things that are a lot more proximate and a lot more time sensitive that necessarily we can solve. But secondly, who probably are the stakeholders who would have opted into this particular technology? We say that it's often the people who are rich, simply because even if opposition says that they're able to develop this and make this probably a lot more, like, for example, accessible, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will be cheap in its entirety. There will still be, for example, time lags that happens within that particular interim period when it becomes accessible, for example. Before that,
Yeah, do you think if we ban Elon Musk from investing into going to Mars, he will redirect all these funds into cancer research?
I think it's very much likely because note this panel, a lot of these particular individuals who have a lot of this influence and money are likely to want to be influential, likely want to create a form of change. That's if, for example, you have cures within cancers or you have machineries that were invested by these particular rich individuals. Perhaps it's not Elon Musk, he chose the space, but these particular individuals necessarily exist. The first argument here is to explain to you why the technology inherently harms far greater people. This is an important factor within framing because firstly, we think access is contingent on opposition gaining opt-in from people. So necessarily this means that, for example, if people do not opt into this, then we can't say agency or all those alternatives as a good thing. But secondly, the duration of the implementation becomes a very, very important factor for people to want to opt in, right? Often there's a big time lag between nations. So for example, first world countries probably have the benefit, but this doesn't translate to, for example, third world countries necessarily. So three things I'll be proving within necessarily why it's significantly harms a lot of people on the ground. The first thing here is on agency. Notice the commercialization of this particular technology means that opposition would probably want the people to opt in or, for example, make this particular technology very much attractive. So narratives like, for example, look, you can live longer, or narratives like this is principally justified to lengthen your parents' age because now this technology exists. It means that they have to make it attractive by using consumerism to let people opt into it, right? The problem here are twofold. The first is that the way that it necessarily deconstructs a society. Notice this particular technology doesn't necessarily benefit all society in its entirety simply because it doesn't bleed in through. Because I've proven to you that probably the people who opt into it are people who already have safety nets, for example. But secondly, even if it eventually happens, and I'm going to spend a lot of time explaining this, inequality happens and it's very, very problematic. And this is me being very charitable of what if this technology actually is implemented and it is implemented well. We think the technology then becomes patented and made expensive, or at least requires multiple prototypes from scientists to necessarily make it accessible. What will then happen? We think what necessarily then happens is that rich people probably would live longer, but even if it works and it is accessible, the entrenchment had already happened necessarily. So you have 2 to 3 generations of inequality where the rich still becomes rich, for example, which means this particular interim period becomes extremely detrimental to multiple people within multiple societies, right? Because secondly, notice it's a biological change, which means every part of your body is genetically changed. But for example, if it doesn't correspond to multiple societies, then it's extremely problematic. Sit down. The weighing here is on two things. The first thing is on agency, simply because people aren't able then to opt out of it, or at least even if they opt into it, the form of information or the consent that is put within them isn't necessarily one that is valuable. But secondly, we've proven to you how inequality happens at a large scale. We would rather not take these particular instances. The second argument here I'll bring in, sit down, is why we solve more problems under our side. Framing here is to understand that there's still a form of scarcity of resource, which means one investment that a rich person makes takes out other investments that probably would have been valuable for other particular sectors. What do I mean by here this, by what government here provides as a solution, right? I think it's far easier under government side to measure, for example, solvency, because you have no idea how to quantify or see how people are happy or how people are actually like medicated or cured under their side. We think then the certainty of fulfilling multiple obligations for three important things. Firstly, in terms of how you're fulfilling your state obligation to actually want to create change for the people on the ground. Or secondly, it can come within family level, how you're able to then fulfill your obligation as a child. Or thirdly, fulfill your obligation on an individual level as to whether you want to opt into this particular technology or not. And this brings me to my next level of analysis as to why the accessibility is something that's really important to be poured into other particular forms of change. So for example, it looks like simple things like having better insulins, having asthma inhaler, things like having like cures for like blood pressure made a lot more accessible for people simply because you just have a whole lot of money, right? Why is it likely to be the comparative under our side, which probably they were going to contend on, right? I think firstly, the rich can no longer control the narrative or the media that necessarily exists within the technology that they support, which means it's likely for them to then buy in, for the public to then buy into what they necessarily want and what they want to demand, which is something that fits the intersectionality of people who probably have things like blood pressure problems, things like diabetic problems whatsoever. But this also translates secondly to the fact that you're able to then better the healthcare system. You're able to have more doctors, you're able to have more infrastructure, better machinery so that you're able to then make better diagnosing, right? But thirdly, it also means that you're able to bleed through, for example, poverty as a problem, right? Simply because you have this particular amount of money and understanding how the magnitude of change that, for example, if you buy what opposition says is really huge, it also can be translated into, for example, uplifting this particular poverty that necessarily happens. Weighing here, two things. The first is on solvency. We've proven to you necessarily if you have that particular amount of capital, we'd better reallocate this particular things. But secondly, on scale, we see a far greater amount of people without the need of consent or agency becoming one thing is not certain. Thanks.
Thank you for the open debate for side opposition calling on Elmo here.
The other day when me and Ram were having a philosophical discussion, Ram said this life is a loop made of smaller loops within loops. And I think the only thing that breaks this loop at the end of the day is death. And unfortunately, that is a breaking of the loop that we do not have control over. It is time we give back power to the people, especially when we're talking about the biggest thing that people don't have control over, and that is death, which is final and irreversible. Firstly, what this technology looks like. And here is where I want to critique the motion. Maybe Sarah is too nice, but this motion gives very weird examples and it's an array of things, right? Firstly, because it talks about like, you can cryogenic freeze yourself, but you can also upload your brain to the cloud. Firstly, I think it can look like sentient forms of technology where you can still maintain that level of sentience. Maybe you upload your consciousness and therefore you can still like navigate around networks, go to like the network in Singapore, go to the network in Portugal, whenever you want, because you have sentient control over how your sentience operates within the cloud. But secondly, it can do like temporary non-sentience. For example, cryogenic storage, like maybe there are better periods of time in the future that you're waiting for. So you freeze yourself now and wait for better periods of time. But thirdly, it can also look like permanently non-sentient. Maybe this life isn't one that you enjoy living in a physical body, but you still have the fear of oblivion. You don't want to be forgotten. And that is why individuals would probably want their memory to live on in this particular way, where if in the event that this uploading of consciousness to the cloud is not one that guarantees you sentience, individuals will still be likely to do this in favor of their memory. binary. Secondly, in terms of opt-out, why do individuals still have the ability to opt out on our side? Number one, if they don't want to live, you just don't opt into the technology in the first place. But secondly, you can pull out if you upload your consciousness if you want to, right? And number one, this is okay because your consciousness already decides for you many things. Like, firstly, your future decides for you things that you maybe want to do now. Maybe right now I want to be a doctor, but when I grow up, I want to be a fireman, right? And your future overrides the consent of your past self in deciding what is best for you at that time. But vice versa, even your past violates that consent. I take antidepressants because I'm depressed right now, even though I don't know what side effects are going to kill me. Maybe it'll kill my sex drive and I'm unable to have like meaningful sex with anyone anymore. But I'm still making that decision because that is what is pertinent to me at that point of time. The TLDR is your past violates your consent, your future violates your consent as well. Therefore, violation goes both ways. We think it's fine when people violate their own consent. But third, our burden then in this debate is we're not proselytizing for or against this technology. We believe that this is a valid form of technology that should exist. And the clincher here is giving choice back to the people. And that is why we think we still defend that. Few responses on the top of my speech. Firstly, Sarah talks about how the fact that we don't invest into imminent diseases. Number one, we've been doing this for damn long already, guys, right? We can still have it on our side because like what you said, these are completely different areas. You would still have people getting symptoms and headaches and stuff. So I don't think like we would just rule out penicillin because even now, even though I'm not like in my 60s or 70s, I still get a migraine after a day of debating. I still need to take penicillin. There will still be demand for those things. But secondly, then demand will still exist overall for medication because even older people who probably believe in religion and probably believe that this technology is one that's sacred-religious in nature and will be going against the will of God are likely to still proceed with the natural process of life where you eventually die. And therefore, these are individuals who would still be seeking treatment for their problems and for their diseases. I would argue that this would be still a large chunk of society that wants to do this. Therefore, the demand for medication is still going to exist. But second response is, what is the incentive? Sarah says people have influence and they want to do this. I mean, Elon Musk had influence. When he had spare change, he bought Twitter. He didn't invest in cancer research. And his idea of like elongating the human existence is not to help humans on Earth, is to relocate everyone to Mars. And there's like nothing happening right there. I argue what the incentive of influential people actually are, besides just vanity projects to suck their own dick, right? But this is opposed to our side, where this tech is probably going to be seen as one that is sexy, right? And that is why Elon Musk is likely going to invest in it. That is why Jeff Bezos probably wants to put his money into it, because tech is sexy, AI is sexy. Anything that says I can put myself into cryogenic sleep is one that is going to be loved by the tech bros. Moving on then to my first argument on why can people consent. Number one, life is a prison. You don't consent to anything anyway. Number one, in terms of the birth lottery, your identity, your race, your sexuality, all decisions you make in your life are in acknowledgement of the things you don't control. I don't apply to top universities if I'm an Indian because I know I'm not going to get in anyway. I might as well target smaller universities because that is what is within my area of capability. But secondly, it's that. Do I have enough time to live with my family? Do I have enough time to like actualize my life at the end of the day? That is a huge consideration that people live their lives and control the way that they live their life in consideration of. But thirdly, it's self-actualization. Your whole life, you live under capitalism. You work and work and work and work, and you don't spend time with your family. You don't spend time living your hobbies. You don't spend time living your passions. And this is what individuals regret at the end of the day when they're unable to self-actualize. At least with this technology, I can see my children slightly longer, even if it's just 125 years. That extra 50 years that I get is one that is golden because I've been working all my life. But secondly, just on the basis of the model, we're likely probably going to give more information to individuals. We're probably going to do things like disclaimers and making them aware of things like consequences, similar to how we carry out medical procedures. Whenever you want to do a surgery, we inform you of all the consequences and all the side effects of opting into this particular treatment. Sit down. Thirdly, then it's visibility. Supporting this technology occurs over a period of time. You can see people who use it, people who don't use it, bad practices of people who use it, good practices of people who use it. You can decide inadvertently how is it that you would want to approach this technology, whether you want to approach it at all. Fourthly, then is emotions and lived experience. Sit down. You live your own life. You are in recognition of the suffering that you have lived. You are in recognition of all the pain that you have paid the price for your entire life. This is likely going to be an individualized decision that people can consent to, right? And that is why we view individuals as rational. Even if the lives that they're living or the conditions around them are not fair or unequal, individuals are still capable of living a rational life. The impact of this is that proof you people can consent, but even in the worst case, consent doesn't exist anyway. Go.
You only expect the technologies for everyone to opt in, including the loved one. How do you have access on your side?
The only way we can have this technology is everyone needs to opt in. No. This will just be a technology. Not everyone has to opt into cancer experimental research for people to have access to it. It's available. You have access to it. You can opt into it. If you want to argue like volume, then volume will increase over time. More people use it, it has to exist first. If it doesn't exist first, more people won't use it. You rely on this mechanism. Secondly, then, why is this choice one that is important? The preface is death is final, irreversible, and it's important to consider what people want when they're faced with this finality. First is cost. You save more money in treatment. A lot of people get into medical debt and have to pay money premiums to their insurances, which they're unable to pay. Secondly is pain. Treatment is painful. My mother puked every night when she got stage 3 cancer and had to go through chemotherapy. I would argue that she would have opted out of chemotherapy if she could upload her brain to the cloud and still live a meaningful life with her family. Thirdly, it's social norms. Currently, there are a lot of problematic social norms, taboos against being gay, conservative ideals, expectation of filial piety. If you're not sentient, you can freeze yourself, wait until Malaysia legalizes gay sex and we repeal sodomy laws. An Indian woman who's treated like shit can wait for a future where Indians are actually valued. But if you're not sentient, it means this life has been too much for you. I'd rather be uploaded to the cloud and navigate around servers and systems than deal with fucking people. The naivety of side opposition is the belief that everybody can access self-actualization. It's the belief that you can go to Spain and Portugal and all these good countries and it's afforded to everyone. It's the belief that capitalism that does not clamp down on the poor, and these people do not even have access to the technology that they say can exist as an option, but no form of accessibility mechanism will proven for the side of opposition. Without that analysis, our analysis still stands that the initial investment to pay for this technology is an exorbitant amount, where that exorbitant amount has to be translated to the lowest common denominator, which is the consumer, and they have to pay out that initial investment because the return of investment has to be high. That is the analysis that they have not rebutted from PM. I want to clarify two things before I extend on two questions. The first thing is that I believe that this debate has to have some form of baseline because the debate requires a heavy investment. So they can't say that they can also invest on some things as well, for example, like insulin, asthma inhaler, and things like that, because it's a zero-sum game. Presumably, some money will be taken out through conventional and objective utility that people still feel and still see within status quo. They have to accept that we have finite resources and it's about the utilization of resources and where we pull in our money as the most objective way that we can judge this debate. But the second thing I would say, just a clarification on the motion. They can't just say that this technology will be super good, where people can have like non-sentient ways of technology and sentient ways of technology. That if you are a cancer patient, you won't be able to feel the harm, the brunt of going through chemotherapy. Because if that's true, they seem to prove the likelihood as to how the existence of technology would manifest under their sides. We are arguing that the initial investment of technology is already bad to begin with. That was the principle that they have not engaged, just to mind you. Few points of rebuttals before I move on to my extensions. The first is that I would like just to argue the agency and just quantify the utility of this agency under their side of the house, their side of the house. Because Ahsan went on a rant of saying that we are scared of the oblivion and therefore having this longevity to elongate people's life is good because we have the fear of oblivion. The first thing I would say is that the analysis of that is contingent upon people having access to self-actualization. So let's argue context here. If they agree that a lot of people can't access meaningful things, for example, self-actualization, grandiosity of going through Spain, Portugal, and things like that, and the existence of capitalistic structure that clamps on our poor people,
those structures will still exist also on the that side of the house, which begs the question: if this structure still exists and you have this technology as an option by purely virtue of agency, how then do people access that agency on the their side of the house? That is why it's better on the other side of the house, where we have more objective utility, where people feel that's proximate to them. Your parents, your mother, your sisters going through high blood pressure, having heart attacks, or for example, seeing poverty around you, and poverty being an important voting issue, a selling point as to how government relocate their budget, and budgeting as to how we need to help poor people, or the most by virtue of the fact that most countries within the world are welfare states who wants to alleviate poverty. Those are objective utility that is proximate to people, and it proves the calculation as to why people put in more funding within these areas. They can't say that people won't put in more funding just because of one example, Elon Musk decided to invest in X. That's not true. There are also other things, for example, foundation being enacted by Warren Buffett. There are also things, for example, the Bill Gates Foundation. There are also altruistic individuals who puts in money to alleviate poverty. Those are proximate things that people care about. So extending life under their side, presumably that would happen, does not proves the likelihood of, for example, people would have meaningful life. There is no certainty. You can have even though you elongate your life, there's no certainty you would have a good life. For example, your parents might die, your sister might die, you might go into a car crash after that. All of these infinite possibilities might happen under their side of the house. They navigated why then this agency is a priori good as opposed to all this objective utility that exists under status quo. Secondly, I would say, is that people can still opt out. And this is why I just want to quantify how they want to heavily invest and the manifestation of this investment, because they want to cop out. They copped out by saying that we will have this an option that if you want, you can opt out and it's okay. How is this technology being sold within status quo? We gave a parallel form first. It's the same as SpaceX, right? This is the intake. It's marketed to people to see that this is the future. This is the technology you should opt into because this is the future and you can get all these other benefits. The way it is marketed to people is that they have to make it attractive, right? Because even if you have this technology just an option and you don't have people opting into this technology, then it's counterproductive. It defeats the purpose, which means you want to have people to opt in this technology. That's why we say the way it's got to be marketed is that it'll be marketed to rich people, and the way how media is being corrected, how the media is controlled and being hijacked by the rich, the narrative will always say that this is your moral good. This will always be beneficial for you because you can see your father and mother 10 or 25 years down the line. The reason as to why this is really important is that the argument of consent under the side is now then manufactured because people shape the narrative around that to say that we always need to elongate our life and longevity is the objective moral goal as opposed to poverty, as opposed to curing cancer, as opposed to decreasing the wait time limit within hospital, as opposed to creating more cheaper insulins or more asthma inhalers to people. All those things, all those finite resources being put into these specific things get loosed out on their side. Sure.
Yes. Just because, sorry, I don't have it anymore. Okay.
Yeah? Anybody? No. Okay. Extension first. I want to first extend on the objective utility on our side and why is it more relatable to people. And this directly engages with Ahsan's characterization that there is no certainty of people putting in more funding towards really like things, for example, cancer, healthcare, betterment of healthcare facilities and insulins and things like that. The first thing I'll just point out, this is the first structural reason. First, these are issues that are faced by many people. Like on the top of my head, right, there are a lot of people who are facing heart attacks. There are a lot of people who have issues with blood pressure. A lot of people that have like diabetes. Or for example, alleviating poverty. These are issues that are important to petitions because these are bargaining chips for them to get electoral votes. All of these things mean that the objective utility versus the uncertainty of whether or not this technology can be beneficial to society is something that we ought to weigh in this debate, because it is better for government funding, it's better funding to come either A, it's not only limited to like altruistic people or rich people, and the other side we also have government funding as well to be concentrated on something that is objective, tangible and certain. And the other side of the house is an uncertainty whether or not this technology will be good for people. It's an uncertainty whether or not this technology will benefit the most amount of people on the other side of the house. So on the other side of the house, best case scenario is only the rich people that can access. And the interim period, that's really hard because at the same time they are funding this technology, poverty is worse. BP, like people dying from diabetes, wait time limit increases get sourced under the other side of the house. And there's the objective harm that they have not rebutted.
10K from side option calling on PLO, here.
the most bigoted thing in this world is your biology, because it sets preferences of your sexual orientation, about your gender, about your socioeconomic background if you're in that community, without any acknowledgement of the suffering that you're going to go through. On side opposition, we free these people from that suffering, and that's why we're incredibly proud to propose this technology. 3 questions in his speech. I'll respond and weigh as I go. First question, I want to critique their counterfactual. Their main critique of our case is richer people can access this, therefore there's an asymmetry of power, there's exclusionary access. But hang on, their counterfactual is additional investments into healthcare. My first response, I'm unclear why richer people cannot supersede these investments in your world as well. Why richer people cannot, access brain surgery, for instance. No trickle-down mechanism on the side, no explanation as to why this counterfactual is something that's likely to be accessed in their world just because it's healthcare, because richer people still exist. But I'm going to flip this by explaining here are 4 lacunas with their pre-existing counterfactual in medical science. What is the problem with medical science? Number 1, in a lot of instances, there are no cure. Your colon cancer or stage 4, there's no cure to it. You're probably going to die anyway. But if you're able to reverse this by having life-extending treatment, yes, maybe this debate gives us fiat to prove that you cannot cure the symptoms of pain, that you can live longer. But the virtue of you living longer, that 6 months becomes longer, decades longer, the fact that there's no cure is something you have to deal with. Second, science doesn't offer uniformity on what's the best treatment. No, thank you. And this is an important nuance. First, doctors often contradict each other. You go one doctor, they say the issue is not you don't have HIV, it's something else. But another doctor might say the actual issue is there's a new gene in you that's problematic. Doctors contradict each other, which means their solution is also pegged to whether the solution is correct and definitive and best for everyone. Third, science make mistakes as well. A lot of times science follows through clinical trials, and then if it's safe, it's on shelves. But a lot of times, even though following that process, there are mistakes. A great example of this is Vioxx. Vioxx is a painkiller that followed through regular procedures of science, but in the end they found that there are a lot of side effects that made people get heart-related diseases, and it was taken off shelves. Their solutions can also be wrong under their side of the house. They can't just access it. Finally, pain. A lot of procedures in the status quo go through immense amount of pain in accessing that. Is life really worth it if you're a vegetable at the end of the debate? These were all instances that deals with the counterfactual of healthcare. They had to have some defense there. No, thank you. Next, we talk about access. I want to give you 5 mechanisms as to how we have access, because debates 3 reasons why we cannot give logical analysis on why it's sufficient. First, research. The fact that, for instance, the ability to live longer means that private firms would pump in money in this because it's seen as something that's commercially good. Second, competition. If you are not pricing your particular product at a price that's palatable or accessible by people, you become obsolete, because this tech is in direct competition with other form of tech, alternative treatment, drugs as well. That's why there's an commercial incentive for you to do so. I'll take one before 4. Third, ROI. Yes, they say you need to get ROI exactly by the virtue that you need in return of the investment means there's likely going to be price controls, or likely for you to have more accessible form of price point in order to get more returns. I told you I took it 1 and 4. Fourth, technology proliferates downwards. Everything that's expensive, your phones, your iPhone 15, becomes cheaper over time. And that's exact analysis to why even if the interim period is expensive, it'll get cheaper over time. Finally, economies of scale. Through our aggressive research is when we can modify, remove certain things that we can omit that are expensive about this technology and therefore make it accessible. The up cost of this is that we're able to prove you structural mechanisms how to improve access. In the interim period where it's not perfect, what are the 2 benefits Ahsan weighed to you that we have? Number 1, research on cures to diseases. Why? Because if you actually research on life-extending treatment, you also acknowledge how your genes work, how your internal organs work, how, for example, specific biological compositions in your body that makes you live longer work, and that research is something that's great to even find cures to diseases on their side of the house. Or better mobility for disabled people. That for far too long, they were never able to do anything because they were blind. Life-extending, not blind, maybe cannot walk, but life-extending treatment actually knows how your organs work, could also potentially find byproducts of the research. In the event that it's not perfect, we still have byproducts of research that massively benefit the most vulnerable. How do we resolve it? No, thank you. The reason why we resolve this clash is that I'm spelling out to you why is it more likely that people are going to have access beyond the 6 reasons I mentioned. Number 1, richer people are more likely to fund this than that. Why? If it's true that rich people are privileged and want access to technology and they will really capitalize on it, by that very logic, it also means they would fund this technology. Richer companies, richer firms, because they want to extend life. Second, so many precedents in the status quo are all on improving life. The fact that we have phones, the way we have remote work options during COVID, all prove that we always assist on more access to technology that improves our lives. That's why there is already precedents for us to have improved access. Thirdly, their case only attacks on fiat. If they move past this and say, even if you can access this and why it's bad, then we'll have a debate. But other than that, I give you 8 reasons why you cannot just argue on fiat. You cannot take this bit. I'll take a point. Okay.
Period where all our harms manifest.
Interim period, we got certain benefits, which I've already weighed you why that's already a net good. But in the interim period, so what? If the world is going to prolong for 50 years, 80 years, 90 years, 100 years, that minuscule 5 years period, you have to weigh why that's so important over so many other years and generations afterwards, where the environment is already fucked to beyond repair. They have an option to live longer for other reasons, like getting more time, for other reasons, like freeing themselves of biological determinism, by other reasons, by fulfilling themselves of obligations that will take away their purpose of life. You cannot either argue on fiat or the small 2 years that's going to happen. Be more charitable and tell me why this is a net harm in the event that it is good. Second extension then. What is the defense against structural discrimination? They said structures are symmetrical, therefore you cannot access this. Number one, the motion already says there is still options like uploading to the cloud. That suggests to me that it's one-off. You can just put your entire life saving once and you stop. You don't have to put money for your food, for your petrol. So all the other life savings that you had that exist in the real world, you have to pay. You can pay it off and be in the cloud. Done. Secondly, suffering would downscale in this world. In a world where richer people access this, in a world where all of these elites also access this, and people upload it themselves to the cloud, in a world where elderly people who get paid by their guardians to go into this, that's when you optimize productivity better. More people to fill in industries, more people to fill in jobs. It's a lesser overpopulated world in a world where people end up in these clouds or end up in those or cryogenically freeze them. Finally, isn't living longer a necessary good? They just said, what if your children die in the end after you extended your life? Number one, I feel like this contingent on examples where happiness is solely packed on another individual. For a lot of people, it isn't. Secondly, you have to prove why the death of your children dying before a parent is common, which I don't think it is. What were some reasons that we said? If it's true that your children died, you don't live life, don't opt into this technology. But you feel like it's a net good to continue life for 3 reasons. Number one, that obligations always took your time, that you have to take care of your father, you never really lived your life. Number 2, that you want just 1-2 years longer to really travel. Number 3, that biological discrimination scratches your face and puts you into suffering. All these are instances where we can free them when we extend life treatment. Their counterfactual is shit. We give people agency. It's a clear up ballot.
I know Ram knows a lot about extending things past the natural lifespan, but the reason why this debate is important is because they never explain why this is something that benefits the most amount of people at the expense of those who need it the most. Because they cannot win the debate by quoting another debate to say life is a prison. Even if they prove that an individual person will gain value from this technology, they have to prove why widespread investment in this particular technology is the most productive use of resources that will be used to help people in other ways. Because for the millions of people who can never access the power of this technology, for the people who have to wait 40 to 50 years until they can finally afford it, we say society is a prison for them. That on our side, we can't change the world, but at least we don't make it actively worse for those people. 3 issues I'm going to discuss in speech. First on the principle, secondly on access, third on other ways of investing. First on the principle, our argument is that people can never consent to the technology. It's the way the technology is produced is in bad ways. That Jeff Bezos aimed to commercialize this by saying that this tech is something that you should use because it's the most moral way to extend your life. That this is the way to make other people around you happy. So this is not speculative. It's how it's manipulated the public norm to say this is a good use of public funding. The best way to help people achieve their autonomy is in this way rather than other ways, which is why the money is best used in this. As compared to things like SpaceX, the direct benefit to the individual person is less certain because that is like spread for things like society, having more science and technology overall. But the way in which we help people individually deal with their medical circumstances, the money for that is now being put into this technology because powerful people are able to shape the way that this is seen as the best option, which cuts out other better alternatives, we argue. But we explain that even if this expands autonomy, why is this less relevant and they cannot win on it alone? The first is that autonomy is not an absolute principle because our standard of bioethics already limit autonomy where we recognize there is a propensity of harm. We have things like human cloning that could be good. We have things like designer babies could be good. We have eugenics could be good. But all these are banned by medical boards and governments because we recognize the propensity for this to create immense amounts of inequality in society. So even if there is autonomy, they never prove why autonomy is the correct metric to judge the debate, even if they win on it, because we explain why current societal norms only preference harm prevention rather than autonomy expansion. Number two, all of the benefits depend on people massively benefiting from it, because their weighing is that, well, all the harms are worth it. If it's good for these people, eventually more people can feel the good out of this. The first is that there's lots of uncertainty with how good this is for people. People might regret extending their life. People might have the risky technologies that end up damaging them rather than helping them. So because there's so much uncertainty with the technology, the autonomy to experience the benefit is a very uncertain benefit in the debate. So their positive benefit is relatively minimal, because how much can you actually change? You can't surpass the autonomy that comes when you get hit by a car, because those are things that are part of life you can't necessarily change. So a lot of the things are things about surpassing the limits of life are things that are relatively minimal benefit, because we explain it infringes on your autonomy and there's other things you can't control. So the benefits are not worth all our harms. Number two, on access. Why is this technology specifically bad? Number one is that life extending technology can only ever get so cheap, even if there are commercial incentives to get cheap. Cryogenic storage. This is incredibly expensive to store all of the human genes in ice for a huge amount of time. Uploading consciousness requires supercomputers that can store data of an entire human brain. The process of research and development, trial and error, are all incredible amounts of money, even if the end outcome of it is good. Number two, there's capitalist incentives to keep this technology exclusive. When you patent it, because people really like this technology, so I can increase the price of it, because no matter what, people demand it because they want to increase their autonomy. So I can make it as expensive as I want. All of their 5 assertions on this is why we can make it cheaper precisely feed into our mechanisms that it will be commercialized over time. Number 3, even if it eventually becomes accessible, the interim period of how poorer people are able to access the technology means the rich get permanent advantages that are harder to overcome. Why is this form of inequality particularly egregious? The reason is that these life-extending treatments create a permanent advantage that can never be overcome because you're bypassing biological limits. Even if status quo is imperfect, it's on a scale comparatively better. There's some degree of randomness. Who is smart? Who is athletic? There's some level of equality when people all die at the same age. That's why they can't assert, well, it's a technology just like any other technology. This technology uniquely exacerbates the harms that will be lessened under our side, because it's bypassing biological limits that will decrease the forms of inequality that rich people can have.
What's the potential of us overcoming the advantages of rich people in your world?
The benefit is at least things don't get significantly worse when someone can hold more years of life to increase their capitalist empire. They can hold more years of life to make things for the poor. At least on our side, we recognize there's a limit towards how bad things can be. Why is the weighing for this important? One, it affects quantitatively far more people on our side, and given that they are the more vulnerable ones, we don't care if a few rich people get to bypass the prison of life. Number 2, this argument is not contingent on proving we invest in other types of medicines. So even if at this point you still don't buy our counterfactual, all our harms of how things become tenfold worse on their side. Yes, it's imperfect. We don't make it worse. Third issue in this debate, other ways of spending money. Let's assume this is a good technology. We explain lots of things can be useful, but the best thing we ought to do is to use resources in the most productive way possible, because resources are limited, because the population is growing, because there is increasing income equality. It becomes a more urgent problem that we have to solve. Why was this the likely counterfactual? Because we explain when rich and influential people being able to warp social narratives, to manipulate public opinion, all of these things will be less powerful narratives on our side, which is why we can push them into using it for public medicines instead. And even if they invest into things like SpaceX or whatever, it's easier to call out rather than when you say that, when they're able to say, well, this is good for you because you can increase your own life. It becomes something that you're less easily able to criticize, which is why public funding is better used on our side. And therefore, the next best option would be investing in these general treatments. Why are these general treatments more important? The first is that the benefit is more certain. Remember, this is the perspective of the government or society at large. It's incredibly uncertain if this person getting 10 to 20 years is good or bad for them. We don't really know. But this is about how governments ought to use budget allocations. On our side, it's far more certain that stopping someone from the harm of cancer is a good thing, which is why Ahsan's harm of chemotherapy being painful are precisely why you should invest to make chemotherapy less painful under our side, rather than feeding into those things. But number 2, on a utilitarian basis, we benefit far more people because they are the ones suffering from more medical conditions. They are the ones who don't have access to this technology. They can't assume that current medical conditions can be surpassed just because you have this technology. Because if you live longer, but you're still suffering from cancer, you live longer, but you still have a broken leg, there is still pain chipping away at all parts of your life. Under our side, we don't make the world worse than it already is. At least there's some degree of representation for people to protect their rights. On theirs, you increase the biological advantages that these people have. The limits can never happen. For these reasons, propose.
They said we cannot quote a debate and say life is prison. In that case, maybe you don't run the richer people have privilege, which is a quote from every debate ever, and I would say even MUN. Two parts to this reply. The first part of this reply is I want to explain what is their defense on their counterfactual. Note that we gave you 4 reasons why the counterfactual is not a steady one. The fact that number 1, you might not have a cure. All the analysis on chemotherapy, but what if you don't have a cure to very terminally ill cancer? Absolutely no response. At least outside, you might have the pain, but you live longer. Second, no uniformity on what's the best decision. That medical professionals contradict each other, which is a lot of times the best decision is at the behest of actually accessing the first place. We don't know what those things are. Third, they make mistakes. They can tell you that's the best decision, but it's not. You get side effects later, opioid crisis. I don't want to go into that now. Fourth, that you go through pain through all these procedures. What would their response? 2 parts. Number 1, that life is arbitrary and arbitrary is fair. Really? Arbitrary climate refugees, immigrants, poverty, LGBT. I would say the arbitrary world is unfair because it's disproportionate and people are shackled by biological determinism. Their second response was that's why we invest in them. More research to make chemo less pain, more research to get better cure. I want to point out, they got more research to make procedures less pain, more money to now make new cures. Isn't that also going to take a long time? If their concern was that our version is not perfect because we have need research, all our problems in medical health and reforming that also takes money. What is the weighing then? If both takes time and to some extent exacerbates rich people, what is the delta that government team is telling us? Because I'm unclear what is the serious exploitation that rich people can have. What is our defense against their case? Number 1, we told you why their worst forms of harm of richer people control are mitigated. Why? It doesn't make sense, right? If you are cryogenically frozen, what can a rich person do? But if it's the case that rich people are power, you freeze yourself and then go back to a society that's more evolved. Even though rich people are in power, there's more liberties in that world. There's a net good. Secondly, we give you like 6 mechanisms to prove access, so thorough of them, not even dislodging any of them, just saying richer people. You can't default to their very mechanism before dislodging ours. Finally, we said certain benefits you have in the event that we fail. Byproducts of this research can be important to find cures to other diseases or treatments. These were all things that we weigh. It's important because we take note that this is something that at least we have to take note because the comparative of both counterfactuals, they gave us no room to explain why our counterfactual falls short in the debate because largely was symmetrical. Second part of the speech, does agency matter? Because their claim was that bioethics go against agency, so agency doesn't matter. That's why we ban things like cloning. Our point is that we don't even see how it goes against bioethics. Cloning goes against bioethics, but it's not because no access. Their defense on why it goes against bioethics is no access. And I don't think that's a very valid reason. The very fact that cloning is unethical because you're duplicating someone else's life, which is unethical, but this is your life and you understand your pain. I'm unclear why no access is a metric to fulfill that very threshold that he talked about in the first place. But secondarily, Ahsan gave you so much of defense of why agency should be valued. The fact that birth lottery didn't determine that you were born, at least now we have consent on when you can die. That biological determinism impositioned you in environments where you did not consent and subjugated you to discrimination and suffering. The fact that finality of death is certain and takes away everything you have, that is the weighing metric. Agency matters because you're vulnerable in all of these instances where your choices are violated. That's why it's something you should care about, because if you illustrate that suffering is something that's certain, now we're freeing you from that suffering at a point in which you can access that choice. This is why it's important. We win this debate because we explain to you, even though their case was shit on why rich people always dominate, we give you so many mechanisms on why we still have agency. Never at any point they say, if you have agency and every people can access this, why it's a net harm? That's why the case loses because it's back to VR. So Umar was right that Ram knows what it's like to extend natural borders and whatever. But that's why he's living his life, quit MITP class, and he won the debate. Not like you. You can just balik rumah, Umar.
They're very dismissive for the scale of benefits that they're trying to prove. I want to clarify three important things. The first thing, that the amount of funds or investments would have been symmetrical under both sides. This is a zero-sum particular debate. They cannot co-opt every single thing. They cannot co-opt research and cure to become the most efficient under their side without wanting to engage with what we actually have in government's side. But secondly, it's important to note that the world doesn't change as soon as you put yourself in this software or into this cloud. For example, we still have racism after 100 years. It's unlikely for them then to suddenly have the best world on their side at the point in which they choose to have a particular longer life. But the third thing to note here then is when Umar told you, for example, how autonomy isn't the metric for you to weigh this particular debate, simply because there's a principle and why this is unethical as to why we do not, for example, support things like cloning or eugenics, because these particular things needs to be more mechanized under their side by not just saying one-liners as to why these particular things probably solve certain particular issues without wanting to go the down line as to how it affects multiple individuals within multiple societies then. But I think the most important question I want to answer before I get into my particular framing is, do people actually want to live longer? Because this is contingent upon all of the cases that they tried to put us. I think two important things to note, because this would probably affect individuals who are already, for example, sick, or individuals who genuinely want to live longer, right? I think it's dependent on how proximate or how good their life necessarily is. These say you need vacations, you're retired, you need to spend time with your kids, or you're in so much pain because of the medication that you necessarily have. The weighing here is it's on scale. If it is inaccessible under their side, then you do not change a large chunk of people's lives. So you do not have, for example, individuals having vacations. You have ultra rich people living in software, and they can probably just tap a button in Italy, for example, but they do not gain the particular benefits that opposition wants to say. But if opposition was super technical, let's play along, right? Where you live in a cloud or you're frozen, this life becomes unfulfilling. You literally live in a literal drive. A lot of people would rather die than live in this particular, circumstances, because they agree that consent or agency would have been never the point as to how you tip the scale. The comparative that we have proven under government from first is firstly on scale, because more medications or more treatments like cancer, like HIV, are particular things that fits into the intersectionality of multiple societies. But secondly, the agency that we necessarily have is that it's a lot more certain. So you're able to make far greater decisions and choices at the point in which you understand the degree of impact that probably this particular medication or treatment necessarily has upon you. Nice. Bring me to my three particular important pieces of framings. The first thing is cure an important factor within this debate, right? Because opposition says that we do not have cure and then they can have better innovation under their side. Let's flip this particular analysis, right? Because if they agree with the fact that, for example, you have better innovation, they have to buy into the idea that commercialization happens at worst under their side, which means these particular investors would have always had the incentive to continue to profit from this particular technology, which means it's unlikely for the narrative to then become something that is not as harmful as we characterize under government side, which means you have worse attractive consumerism tactics in order to have people to opt in. And this is detrimentally harmful for their case. But secondly, the investors means that you have more resource on our side to find better cure, to find better treatment, because you do not allocate these particular instances and you do not let the narrative control multiple people's discourses, right? This becomes a tipping point, because if you buy the idea that resources are scarce, we utilize these particular things on the government side. Second thing on access, right? Check your notes. All deputy says on access is price control, competition, economics of scale. This isn't an iPhone, for example. Their biggest benefit is on agency. For example, you can go on vacation, multiple things, right? But the market that necessarily exists at the point in which you have this particular commercialization in order to get accessibility becomes really, really harmful for multiple individuals, which brings me to my third particular point on inequality, right? We think at the point in which they were uncharitable to engage in the fact that patents are being made, the rich will continue to live longer. You cannot just say that the interim probably will just become eventually cheaper. No, that's not the answer. 2 to 3 generations of economic inequality between multiple societies would have still become the problem. They say we have this problem too, but we say no, because at the point in which you buy into the idea of treatments and medications that one that actually fits multiple individuals, that's the world in which it's far more preferable for multiple individuals. For all those reasons, go.